Welcome to the Close the Chapter podcast. I am Kristen Boyce, a licensed marriage and family therapist with a private practice, Pathways to Healing Counseling. Through conversations, education, strategies, and shared stories, we will be closing the chapter on all the thoughts, feelings, people, and circumstances that don't serve you anymore and open the door to possibilities and the real you. You won't want to miss an episode, so be sure to subscribe. Welcome to this week's Close the Chapter podcast. You will want to tune into today's episode. It is key to understanding how to set boundaries. We're exploring family imprints and how they impact you and how you feel about yourself in your current relationships. It is so important. And I loved my conversation with the guest. Before I jump into that, in order to help you on your healing journey, be sure to grab the free journal that's available right now to go to Kristen D. Boyce, KRISTEN Boyce, BOICE.com/free resources, and it will be emailed to you. You can also follow along on social at Kristen D. Boyce on Instagram and Facebook, and just Kristen Boyce on TikTok and Pinterest, all the places. And I try to post helpful content and information. So I would love to have you chime in, make comments, share, whatever you feel led to do. I would be so grateful for that. So let me introduce you to today's amazing guest. Johanna Lynn has 20 years experience in resolving inherited family patterns and is the founder of the Family Imprint Institute with an international private practice. Johanna is a highly trained systemic therapist that offers resolutions from long-standing issues with the focus on dismantling family patterns, restoring relationships, and cultivating resilient boundaries. Please listen to the very end, because it captured such an important point about our family history and emotions that don't get felt by our primary caregivers or our parents, and how that gets transmitted onto our children generationally. So it's such a good episode on family systems, how it impacts you, why it's important. If you're dating someone, this is a great episode for you. If you're in a marriage, if you just are in a family, this is so significant. Or maybe you're on a growth journey, you're in therapy, take your notepad out, write down what resonates with you, make comments on social media. Let me know what you think. I really would love to know what landed for you, what was hard, maybe it was a new thought or an aha, because that's why I do this podcast, to help you be more of yourself, heal your wounds, and release things that aren't yours, that you just inherently took on in your family system. So without further ado, here is this week's episode with Johanna Lynn. Welcome to this week's Close the Chapter podcast. Thank you so much for joining us for this important episode. I am so excited about my guest today, Johanna Lynn. Welcome to the Close the Chapter podcast.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here with you.
I love having a fellow therapist on the podcast because it feels like we have a common connection in language. And a lot of my listeners are in therapy or want to start going to therapy or doing growth work in some form or fashion.
Yeah.
So the fact that you're here with us today to talk about boundaries, self-help, how to find healing is so important. So, and I love that you're talking about generational traumas and patterns. So if you wouldn't mind sharing a little bit about yourself so the audience can start learning more about who you are.
Yes, absolutely. And so I joke with my clients that none of us get to be the way we are by accident. And so that's a big part of coming to completion, or I love the name of your show, Closing the Chapter. A lot of it is looking back at, gosh, how did I show up in love? Or what did I maybe tolerate that felt too familiar from my family of origin style of love that kind of tangled things up in my current relationship? And a lot of closing that chapter is learning to trust ourselves again, learning that discernment. Why am I attracted to certain people or patterns? And really choosing with a conscious awareness as we step back into loving again. So that's really a part of what I guess inspires me about my work, this sort of fresh new opportunity to begin again but this time well-educated, well-grounded, well-resourced, and we can start with a much stronger footing.
A lot of people say, I don't want to go back. Why are we having to
Yeah.
go back in order
Yeah.
to do healing work? What do you say
It's,
about that?
I want my cooking to be something off of this beautiful cooking show, but I don't want to read the recipe. And so really, we all have a love blueprint. And that's why I call my institute the Family Imprint. And so this idea that we are literally imprinted at the level of the DNA with experiences, yes, of course, traumas, but even unresolved emotions that our parents had, even our grandparents had. So these heartbreaks or losses or griefs that were never resolved, they don't simply go away. They find a way to live out again in the younger generations. So if we're just looking at ourselves, maybe our past relationship or even our own childhood, we're only getting a very tiny part of the story. And I like to explain that my clients are like one square of a quilt, and we're wanting to look at the whole quilt. We're wanting to bring in all the components so your whole family history shines light that I guess we just didn't look at it that way before. And it gives us a way to move forward with so much more confidence and insight.
It's one of the most important pieces, I think, to freeing ourselves, to figure out that family imprint piece. So when some people come into therapy, they say, I had a great childhood. It was great. I had a great family and everything was so good. How do you respond to that?
Well, I love this approach in that I really only have to work with the facts of the family. And so I want to honor that's the truth for the client in that moment. And I want to look at the information I'm gathering to fill out what I call the 3-generation genealogram. So I want to understand things like what was going on for mom when she was pregnant with you? Oh, well, I was a surprise. Mom and dad weren't even married yet. Or, oh, my closest sibling to me we're 10 years apart. I was definitely unexpected. This changes that early symbiotic relationship we have between ourselves and mom. Not to say there's any judgment or anything wrong with it. It's just any of us who are mothers, we can know, oh, I'm not quite ready to be pregnant. It doesn't mean we're not going to be loving and caring to that child. It just means it may take us a few months to get on board with it, to get ready for it. Other circumstances can be more practical and financial, like mom having to go right back to work and we're off in a daycare, we're 6-week-old infant. And so this breaks that attachment, that need for any little baby to feel I'm loved, mom's got me, my needs are met, that familiar smell, that connection with mom. When that gets broken, it changes the way we relate to love. It changes even our expectation of the other. And so for your listeners, I'm certainly a working mom. There will be always separations between us and our children, but it's how those separations are repaired that has the long-standing impact around how we then show up in our intimate, loving relationships as an adult, or even the patience and connection of care we have with our own children. That comes from how we were loved.
Yes. Okay. So let's unpack separations and what imprints separations if you're separating from mom, primary caregiver, dad. Talk a little bit more about separations.
Well, there are so many times this can happen. Let's say even in the first 7 years of our life before the child really hits that individuation stage. So as I say, it can happen in utero, and there are all kinds of beautiful studies done. Actually, there's an incredible documentary titled In Utero that has many of my famous researchers and scientists that talk about this shaping time before we've even taken our first breath and how much it is mapping out our brains and this anticipation of the family that we're going to be born into. And then, of course, we have our birth experience, and there's 1,001 reasons why things can kind of get off track there. Was it a difficult birth? Did mom have a medical emergency? Is it just typical sort of hospital policy where we take the baby down to the nursery and we've got that initial separation? Mom having to go right back to work, or maybe mom and dad hitting a rough patch in the marriage and heading off for a vacation, and the baby's just a year old, and thinking, oh, they'll have a great week with grandma and grandpa. And that very well may be true, cared and loved for, and all those lovely things. But the attachment patterning is this deep connection with mom's gaze into baby, the familiar smells, that rhythm and comfort. And so there's this sort of feeling in the body that can look a little bit like defense or keeping people at an arm's length. It's almost as if the baby is mulling together, I'm not so sure I can trust this connection business. And so, of course, it's not a thought so much as a body memory. And then mom and dad come back from vacation, and we've got this independent little child we've come home to. And so I think in our culture, we celebrate early independence in children. But to be honest with you, it's actually our first red flag because they've stopped trusting you're going to really be there. So there's this almost protection strategy around, I'm not going to get that rug pulled out from under me again. I'll just do it.
To make this in practical terms for folks, I was looking at my separation. A Geneagram is looking at a family history of relationships, patterns, cutoffs, addictions. We're looking at generations back of patterns. Is there another way you would frame that?
Yeah, it's almost like we want to look at filling out the family tree. And instead of finding my second removed uncle's name is Harry, we actually want to find out what relational experiences went on there. I like how you said that. Where did love get cut off? Where did someone get compromised? Or who went off to jail? Who maybe spent time in a mental institution and was then excluded from the family? We want to look almost where that family tree, the branch broke off, because it has huge impacts on the generations that come after.
And I think if you're doing this with a therapist, one of the things I think when we look at separations, so I did this and I looked at my mom she was the only child. And my grandfather, he was a chemist and helped invent fluoride for Crest, the toothpaste. He traveled all over the world speaking.
Wow.
And so there was many separations. And so my mom really, of course, had abandonment wounds from dad traveling and the reentry and then the separations again. And then she had separation anxiety from me. So when she was separated from me, so it can transfer in many different ways. And then I had separation anxiety when she would drop me off the church nursery for whatever she was off doing. I remember feeling panicked that she would drop me off in this weird place and I didn't know where I was. And so if we look at our family history with separations, it's one of the most important explorations, I think.
Well, it really, really is. It gives us a context and understanding. And sort of as you're sharing that, I'm remembering back learning my mom's history because she's always been very worried. Be careful, call me when you get home. And it used to just, I think, oh my gosh, I know how to drive. My goodness, I'm a grown woman. But instead, understanding, oh my gosh, there was so much loss, so much unexpected, this feeling that anyone could go at any time. And so I started to hear when she would say, call me when you get home to let me know. That's her way of saying, I love you. I want you to be safe. I'm thinking of you. And so I started to hear it from that way instead of how it used to feel like nails on a chalkboard. And so it can really change how we can receive the language of care that comes through our family as well.
Okay, let's take this example. I love to dig into this because it's so applicable. I mean, how many moms worry about their kids because they're afraid of something bad happening? Loss, grief, pain. And they feel like that's unbearable, especially if they have a history of loss, grief, and it's unprocessed. See, I feel like my mom didn't really process her separations, even though my mom was a therapist, which is plot twist. So she didn't really process it. And I think if we don't process it, then it can get displaced and transferred.
That's exactly right. I have read so much research around it's actually less about what happens to us, the specifics, and it's more about how we make sense of it, how we come to completion with it. And so even those capital T traumas, they don't have to be our reference point. They don't have to be, oh, this is my sort of self-made prison because these things happened to me. But it's more about what we do with what's happened to us.
Yeah. So how do I tolerate the separation, especially using our example with our kids, because I can feel that way too. I can notice it in my nervous system and just the worry, the concern, but it's really my unprocessed, because it's healthy for I don't say trauma, but my unprocessed emotion around some fear or has
Yeah.
something bad happening, and how do I self-soothe? How
Right.
do I tend to that so I don't have my child try to soothe me through
Yes.
that, so they can separate and individuate, which is an important, healthy part of human development, and I don't disrupt that.
Exactly. Well, and I love what you just said, because oftentimes we can turn into our child for care, to make us feel better, to reassure. And oh gosh, it's so intense when we turn to our children to help us to feel better, to bolster us up, because our kids will do it. Their love is so deep and so, in a way, blind love. And so we've got to stay in that place of the parent, the adult. I'm here to take care of you. And so there are moments, of course, that our kids will catch us worrying or even crying or slamming a door because we're angry. We're human. We share the same home environment. But it's so important to be able to address in that moment, to say, here I am having my emotions. I just got upsetting news, but I've got this. I'm going to talk to your dad later. Or I'm going to talk to auntie, or I'm going to talk to my friend. I don't need for you to take care of this for me. That's a very important boundary between parent and child.
I think it's one of the most significant. So we can go back into the genogram, our family tree, our family history, and look at, where did I take on someone else's emotions that they didn't get to process, but I took it on as my responsibility to make them feel better, loved, happy, so they didn't have to worry about me. We switched roles somehow along the way. Do you typically see that generationally?
Oh gosh, I see it every day in my clients. There's 40, 50, 60-year-old people who have never considered, oh my gosh, I took care of a sad mom or an addicted dad or a worried parent. And I've kind of developmentally learned to go over there with the other person. So I'm much more aware as a grown adult what's going on with them, but I've got no idea what's going on inside here. So then if that person says, oh, hey, can you help me move again? Or can you listen to me complain endlessly about my marriage? We don't know that line in the sand, because we're so taught to be over there making the other person feel okay. And then this is where sort of unspoken resentments just sort of goes under that proverbial rug. We don't address it, but it often ends up collapsing the relationship. We just move away from it rather than say, here's a healthy boundary, or here's a way I want to protect our relationship. You keep talking about this problem and you're not even applying the suggestions I'm saying. So let's just leave it there. Whatever you're going to do is right for you, but please don't come and just complain every time we go out for coffee.
Yes, I think this is so powerful. I'll teach clients to say, that's between you and dad or you and mom.
Exactly.
And I'm not the appropriate person to be commenting or getting in the middle of that between.
Well, I often have a lighter way to say that, because it comes up so often.
Yes.
To just say, so like mom's unloading typically as she does about dad, and you just simply say, hey, mom, that's my dad you're talking about. I don't even know what to say. And I just feel so uncomfortable, because now I only look at dads through the way he hurts you. I kind of lose out on having my dad. And so if we can say it that way, I think it stops it from repeatedly happening again. Because many of my clients will say, oh, I've tried to tell her not to talk to me about dad, but she'll forget.
Exactly.
Yeah.
That's a great way to
just
say it.
Factually.
Let's talk about when somebody doesn't respect your boundary in the family systems. Because we look at the generations and we're mapping it out. We're looking at the imprints and we look at lack of boundaries. Maybe they're real diffuse boundaries, or we have enmeshment. Enmeshment means we don't have, you're almost kind of joining in with another person. That's where you were talking about going to the other side.
Yes, exactly.
And joining them, you see how their emotions, but not your own.
Yes,
or
that's
you even
exactly
take on their emotions as your own, don't really have the opportunity to explore. So talk about the importance of looking at history of boundaries.
Well, I think the primary thing to remember about that is the boundary is not about the other person. So a boundary is about keeping me in. So this idea, let's imagine we've got hula hoop around us. We've got a little bit of space around our body, and that's this sort of image of the boundary. And so it's not about keeping mom's comment out or keeping dad's criticism over there. It's about keeping me in. Because let's face it, mom and dad probably aren't going to change too much. And so when that comment comes in your direction, it's about you having that self-regulation, that boundary, that sense of, okay, I'm losing myself a little bit here. I sort of hurt, or that I want to get back and kind of defend myself. And so that we're not sort of going down what I call the same neural highway that just sinks us every time. We have sort of this dance in a way that we play out again and again. And this boundary kind of keeps you in so that when that typical thing happens, you can respond from one of those very factual, non-reactive sort of places, similar to, hey, that's my mom you're talking about, Dad. I feel so uncomfortable. And so notice it's about I feel statements, and instead of blaming out their statements, because there will be people in your family that will not respect your boundary, will continue to go over that line. And you think, gosh, I tried to set that boundary with them. What's going on? It's because, again, you're out there thinking about them and their acceptance of your boundary instead of staying inside of yourself and what that feels to, okay, I'm really going to say no. I'm going to let this person down. I know I am. And how do I stay with myself even as I do that? Because I know this request will put our friendship or relationship out of balance.
And to tolerate that. See, I feel like that's a big piece, because they're like, I don't want them to be mad at me. I don't want to lose relationship with them. I don't want to hurt them.
Totally.
And so
it becomes easier to say yes until it isn't.
Becomes easier just to continue with the fawning response, that people pleasing response, because the discomfort and the unknown of setting the boundary, folks, they don't have a tolerance for that. So how do you help people tolerate that they may be upset, that they may not like it, that they may not respect your boundary?
I guess it's a bit of a process with some practice. And I think everything about this work is always about looking at the big picture. So the big picture is, if you keep saying yes when you really mean no, what do you think is going to happen to this friendship over time? Maybe in a handful of months or a handful of years, but it will meet that brick wall. There's 70 orders of love that go into the work that I do. And I tell you, I don't know why this stuff isn't taught in school, but we come across it when we get into therapy and when we kind of are trying to sort our stuff out. But one of the primary orders of love is the balance of give and take in relationship. And this is so essential to keep the relationship healthy. So a lot of what I share is, if we're overgiving, we're often putting too much, I guess, impact on the relationship. And it's usually the overgiver that ends up collapsing the relationship over time. The other side feels emotionally indebted. There's this place or this guilt maybe around, I can never balance things. And an imbalanced relationship doesn't last, doesn't thrive. There's always these unspoken hurts, and it tends to just sort of either fall away in distance, or there's some big spark or some big fight. And it's because of the imbalance that's not being honestly spoken about.
And here's another piece I think people say often, at least this is what I hear. Well, they're not going to change anyway, so what's the point?
The point is getting your body to trust you again. When we keep going over our own boundaries, our body keeps score. That's such a famous sort of trauma book, but our body holds the weight of it. And another beautiful book is called When the Body Says No. So I have had countless cases where the woman will say, well, finally, I don't have to host my husband's, stupid business parties and have to do all the cooking and all the shopping. And now I have fibromyalgia, and he doesn't ask. And so if I can't say no, or honey, this is too much, I'll, help a caterer, or let's just some distance, your ability to verbally say that doesn't work for me, our body will start to say that for us. A lot of my work with chronic illness that's the core of it. That's it right there.
So when you help people with boundaries, because there's so much out there on boundaries and being clear on articulating boundaries, how important is the imprints of family systems in breaking free for yourself to honor yourself? Because it's not about the other person. Like you said, boundaries are not about the other person. They're about you. Even if the person doesn't change, you're stepping into more health.
That's right.
You're stepping into more health yourself. So how important is the imprint of family systems and exploring that to be able to get to boundaries
it's
work?
everything, to be honest, because if we just read a boundaries book, but we've been taught to be the good girl, to be the helpful one, in order to be loved, you have to jump through these hoops. We'll read these words and it's like, is this another language? What am I supposed to do with this? Or it just feels so darn wrong. There's no way we can actually implement it. And so we've got to look at that imprint. Who was I taught to be? What does it mean to feel guilty about maybe letting my mom or my grandma down, but to be able to move forward in my own life in a way that's right for me? And so I love how you phrase that boundaries is about moving towards our own health, even if the other person doesn't change or maybe keeps over asking for things that are too big. It's really never about the other person. And so I wish it was as simple as reading a book and just having the one statement that you say, but it's so much more nuanced than that.
It's deep work. It really is, especially when you believe, to your point, this is kind of bad. If I say how I feel, if I speak my truth and have it with love and grace and say my opinion or set a boundary, whatever that looks like for somebody, that is in the bad category. So we almost as a child split off from that shadow side.
Yeah.
It became, this is what is acceptable, lovable, then I will stay in connection. I will not be abandoned. I will not be rejected if I do these things, which is accommodate, peacemaking, overgiving, overfunctioning. I mean, we can go through a whole list.
Totally.
So people are afraid. And I'm like, it's not an all or nothing. Like we're dancing in the gray. We're dancing in the and in both, but they're afraid to be bad or be disconnected from their primary caregivers.
That's it. Well, and even to be judged as selfish. So there's this, I'll deplete myself. I'll go into burnout. I'll hive off this whole part of my body just to be not deemed as selfish. We end up sort of like on the very bottom rung of our own, who we're caring for. We're last on our own list to avoid all of the things you're talking about. And so we do have to sort of holistically come in to look at all those parts of ourselves, how we got to be the way we are, why being good means giving yourself away for connection or helping others to the point of complete exhaustion. We're just kind of trying to find that balance. Not that we don't want people to be kind and generous. Of course, we want to keep that going. But how do we keep that within the parameters of kindness? Kindness to self, as well as kindness to those we're sharing our life with.
Yes. So what are the 3 biggest keys in your life doing this familial imprint work? What are some of the 3 keys? And you don't even have to have 3, but that you really applied in your life that have been life-changing?
What a deep question. I think looking at the big picture always. Let's first say an example. I have a conflict with my spouse. So immediately we could take it personally. We could build a story that, well, he never listens when we get into conflict, something like this. And instead of doing that, if I can understand the full context of how conflict went in his house growing up as a young boy, and that there's a need to process the emotion, think things through before responding, I'm less likely to take it personally, more likely to give space, more likely to come back in an hour, in a day, to have a true conversation about what the issue is really about, than kind of nitpick and bicker at each other in the moment. So when we hold the larger picture, we're always able to sort of respond from a larger context with understanding and compassion. And I think that right there can help our relationships in huge amounts when we're not as reactive. The second pillar, I'm sure, would be this healthy boundary and recognizing it comes from inside of me, that I'm not trying to convince somebody of the value of my boundary, that I hold it deep inside of me. And the third, I guess, over time, as I've sort of gotten older, is the recognition that self-care is not essential oils and bubble baths, although that might be a component of it, but it's about honoring sort of my energetic capacity. And I think that's extra evident when we're self-employed around how am I structuring my schedule? What parts of myself am I giving out? And what do I need to do to replenish? And how can that be consistent when everyone who's been an entrepreneur for a couple of years knows there's all these ups and downs and different times, but how to really put your self-care first before what the business needs, what everybody else requires.
Yes. And I'm wondering too, this whole idea that you alluded to at the very beginning of our conversation, we touched on it. I'm wondering how big this is you mentioned something like what our parents didn't process emotionally. You kind of allude or didn't really connect to or didn't feel that we end up carrying that.
Yes. So another way to say that is what our children express is what is unexpressed in us or unresolved in between mom and dad for them. And so I'll have many couples or parents just call and say, oh my gosh, my teen is doing this. My 7-year-old is doing that. When can you see them? And I say, oh, when can you or your spouse join for the session? Not to place any blame, not at all, but to build the 3-generation genealogram to understand what is this behavior referencing? Where does it point to? Because that's where the resolution is. It's not in the 7-year-old or the teenager. It's in the larger family system. And so being able to guide the parents with how to speak to the child, redirect the behavior, look at it from a larger context, changes everything.
Can you give a practical example of where the child's behavior is what isn't being kind of processed in maybe between the marital dynamic or maybe a parent's own, just so folks can kind of really grasp this concept in a practical way?
The cases that are coming to me are rather intense, like self-harm and stuff like that. So I'm trying to choose one that's a little more everyday.
Well, self-harm is an epidemic right now. So I think that would be practical. I'm seeing a lot of self-harm in teens.
It is an epidemic. Okay.
You don't have to give too much info.
Yeah.
Just giving that would be a good example.
So the 16-year-old, very unfortunately, lots of self-harm and trying to work with school counselors, social workers, traditional talk therapy, just that feeling any parent would have, we've got to get our daughter some help. And looking at the family system, I was lucky enough to be able to work with both parents. Sometimes it's just one. And often that can give us enough information about the system. But it turns out that around the same age, sort of mid-teens, dad had a very big trauma and shut down all of his emotions. So really was sort of low-level depressive, non-communicative, would really work and provide. And that's kind of all that he could do for the family because that was his way of managing the trauma that happened. And so when we look at this systemically, it's almost dad saying, this is unconscious, of course, but dad saying, what I cannot feel, what I cannot process, you feel it all. And so now his teen has her own, life is difficult, life is crazy for teens these days, post-pandemic, but also the unprocessed emotions that dad has put in Pandora's box and put all the locks on there. So what I can't process because it was too big, because I've shut down, is now for my kids to work through. So that's sort of the way that it moves through the generation. These things don't just go away. They don't just disappear. Even when we pass away, they are shared with our descendants.
I think Richard Rohr had a great quote. What isn't kind of faced, I'm paraphrasing here. It's what isn't dealt with is transmuted.
Yes.
Is transmitted.
Yes, that's exactly
something
right.
Along those lines, because it will transmute unconsciously. It's not like you're intentionally doing this.
Well, it's imprinted in the DNA.
Yes.
I mean, it's not just, did I model this? And I think that's what many parents say to me. Oh, well, we argue after the kids go to bed, or they don't know. They know.
I think that's a big takeaway from our conversation today. I really believe that is a significant takeaway. And you gave a really helpful example of what this really looks like that can be, okay, that makes sense.
We need to see it in real time. Yeah.
Sometimes we just kind of need to visualize it or hear it to go and then we can start processing our own part in that. Have I shut myself off from a certain emotion even? Has my parent anger wasn't acceptable? So I shut that off and now I've got a really angry teen.
Yes, exactly.
And because we didn't do that in our house, we obeyed and we respected. So that's another example of even an emotional cutoff that we weren't allowed to feel because it wasn't safe, it wasn't acceptable.
Yes.
Then can get played out the next generation down. or even a couple
Exactly.
generations down.
Well, and let's face it, then we as the parent has no idea what to do with this because we didn't walk through that in our own parenting relationship. And so the other consideration when you're doing generational work is how we were parented is very different from how we're parenting today. Cutting our parents a bit of slack that there wasn't Psychology Today on every waiting room table of the magazines, or therapy was still very stigmatized, even when my parents were my own age. And so thankfully, we're seeing some of that mental health stigma drop away. And there's a very proactive element about, hey, if you're troubled with this, go into any bookstore. There's shelves and shelves of options, or reach out and get the support that you need.
And podcasts. And now we have the 988 number where you can text or call. And that's like 911 if you've got a medical emergency or something along those lines. Now we have kind of a mental health emergency number here in the United States.
I'm so glad to hear that.
It's called 988, and you can call and text, and mental health clinicians are on the other side managing the calls or the text messages. So we're now really elevating that conversation. And they did 988 because here in the States, 911 is the emergency number. And so they made it for mental health 988. So I think we're making some traction. This has been a wonderful conversation. My heart's lit on fire having these talks. So thank you so much. Where can people find you? And I know you have a boundaries program coming up too. Would you mind sharing that?
Absolutely. So I have a free class coming up on Thursday, March 2nd. It's at noon Eastern time. And so we'll put a link to the bottom there. They can register if you're interested. And I do a 10-week class that dives into restoring relationships, cultivating boundaries, that really goes into this topic in depth. And so you could really dive deep into that one. And you're welcome to just visit my site to read some blog posts and listen to some previous podcasts at www.johannalynn.ca.
Wonderful. And your voice is very soothing. You've probably been told that multiple times. But it's very soothing and nurturing.
Thank you.
Yeah. So I'm sure everyone listening in your nervous systems are like, So feel free to listen to it again, share the episode, start a dialogue and a conversation. I did a genogram, obviously in grad school when we were getting our master's. I'm guessing you might have done that. Did you do that as well?
Yes, I've done many a genogram for myself and my family members. Yeah.
And I recommend if you're in a partnership with anyone, also that person doing one, in a mental health therapist trained specifically in marriage and family therapy. And there's other practitioners out there that know how to do that. That's a great way to start. Is there any other resources if someone wants to do that on their own, or do you recommend working with a therapist?
Well, I think it's great to start to map it out, just build your own sort of family tree. And then it starts our questioning about, hey, what could I ask Auntie when I see her for tea? Or if our parents are still here or our grandparents, we can start to ask some of those relational questions. What was your childhood like? How did things go? We want to kind of understand our own history, the better we know ourselves.
It's key. And before you get married, please do this family imprint work.
Oh, yeah. I couldn't recommend that enough.
2 months into my dating relationship, I'm married to my husband now, 21 years. And I said, let's go and do family history. Let's get it all on the table. And it was the best investment we ever made. 2 months into dating. Because I was like, let's get it out.
Yes.
When you understand that your family history, it doesn't define you. It helps you understand how you're relating relationally and the patterns you might have unconsciously developed in your relationship. So I highly recommend anybody out there that is in an early relationship, do premarital therapy now, someone that's trained in this. So you can understand, to your point, your number one point that you were saying earlier, that you can understand the context and the bigger picture of what's really going on in a disagreement and your family system. So if you want to change the family system, this is how: awareness.
Definitely.
And willingness to explore and do your own work. So thank you so much, Johanna, for being on the show.
It was such a pleasure to chat with you.
Yes.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much for listening to the Close the Chapter podcast. My hope is that you took home some actionable steps along with motivation, inspiration, and hope for making sustainable change in your life. If you enjoyed this episode, click the subscribe button to be sure to get the updated episodes every week, and share with a friend or a family member. For more information about how to get connected, visit Kristen, Kristen, D, Boyce, BOICE.com. Thanks and have a great day.